Just because you just heard of Ahmaud Arbery and you just heard of George Floyd and you just saw Amy Cooper, this has been going on forever and a day in many forms. I mean, just to think about Rodney King, they barely had video at that point. That was videotape that somebody, got a picture of his being beaten at the hands of the cops. Those 4 cops got off. I mean, these are issues to discuss. So, it's to see it all bubbling to the surface and to see many iterations of the conversation going on in all kinds of groups is really something. If nothing else, people have gotten, I hope, to a higher level of understanding about how these structures are. It's not an individual, I didn't like you, you didn't like me because of my race. It's embedded into our systems in ways that sometimes people can't see.
Our guest this evening is Callie Crossley. Callie is a reporter, journalist, producer. She is an award-winning journalist and currently a fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Group, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. She is a frequent guest on Boston Public Radio, has hosted several programs, both nationally and locally, and also an amazing award winner. We'll hear a little bit more about Callie's accomplishments, including an amazing award for her role as a producer in the documentary series Eyes on the Prize. Callie, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are and how you're doing?
Thank you, David. I am actually in the studios of WGBH in my office in the newsroom. That's a little bit unusual these days because GBH is open for business, but closed to most staff. So there are very few of us in here operating, though all the programs keep going as many people are working from home. You might hear that from some of our anchors as they say they're reporting from Lexington or wherever their particular basement is at this moment. But I came in, I'm one of the people that comes in, and I came into my office to have this conversation.
That's great. You have a great looking background behind you.
Thank you.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about what is hanging on the wall there?
This is a piece of kente cloth, which is Ghanaian. It's actually antique, and a friend of mine found it on Martha's Vineyard, one of my favorite places, in an antique shop on Martha's Vineyard many years ago. The thing that I like about kente cloth is that it's woven by men. So I like to think that, all these men wove this huge piece of material just for me. It has a long and rich history. Most recently, there was some back and forth discussion about Democratic congresspersons wearing what looked like a piece of kente cloth while kneeling in relationship to a tribute or in honor or to acknowledge the death of George Floyd. And some people thought that was inappropriate. But in my office, it's all along the big wall, along with many other trinkets and some of my awards and everything else that I can stuff in here. A lot of books too, David.
I'm glad to hear it about the books for sure. Yeah. We'd probably be remiss if we didn't spend a few minutes at the start of our conversation tonight just remarking on today as the day the funeral for George Floyd was held in Houston this afternoon. And, we learned of his tragic and horrifying death at the hands of a police officer in Minneapolis within the last few weeks. And we're also seeing protests, not just here in Boston, but nationally and indeed internationally in response to this particular killing. Would you like to offer us some thoughts on the current moment?
Yes, it's an amazing moment on many levels. So to begin with, much of what's happening now mirrors history. We can talk about that later if you want, but these are some scenes that many of us have seen before, except that the makeup of the crowds are racially quite different. There's a lot of white people, as has been noted by many, but there's a lot of young people too. So Yep, there's some old hippies in the crowd, of course, but the young people are really driving this. And I think that's really important to note. And I mean, not just young professionals, but young people being brought there by their parents. I think that there has been a kind of coming together around structural change, which is interesting. Often what happens at some of the protests like this is that people are expressing their anger and frustration, and they say they want change, but they don't necessarily come up with some details about how it should be accomplished. So what we've seen in a lot of the crowds and what they're asking for now are some very specific changes to police reform and even more, which again, we can talk about later in greater detail if people want to. So it just reminds me of it. There are many echoes of history as I look at it. There's some of that makes me sad because we're repeating, and when will it stop? In fact, I've spent a lot of time, I feel like, in mourning, just mourning the moment that brings us here again. Mourning, of course, for the family of George Floyd and George Floyd himself, because that was horrific. Mourning for where our democracy may be in this moment. So that's sort of where I am. In terms of the journalism, which is what we're going to talk about here today, there's been some fine journalism, and there have also been a few missteps. And so we want to think about all of that because it's all of a piece. But there is public discussion at a level that I didn't expect to be sustained now about 14 days after his death. And it's pretty intense conversation, and I think that's a good thing.
So does that feel different? I mean, we can all turn back to any of the recent deaths that seem similar, like whether it's Freddie Gray or Ahmaud Arbery or you posted recently this article that we might be at a tipping point. It's on the WGBH side, but does this feel different for some reason?
Well, you're referencing my commentary, my most recent commentary. And I think that it feels like it's a tipping point for many of the people who are actively involved in the protests. I'm just a little bit more cautious because some of these scenes seem similar to what I've seen in the past or what I've read about or what we know about. It's really about the long game. Now, that's something I've written about many times because I had the privilege of covering and doing a documentary series about the civil rights movement. And what we know, the central thing one should take away from that, it was the long game. They began their organizing efforts not knowing what the end was going to be. And by the way, not even knowing if they would be successful. What they determined at the beginning was that this is something I'm committing myself to. This is something that has to be changed. And so if I am the person that's going to actually lay my body down, if it comes to that, then that's what I'm committed to in this moment. And I don't know how it's going to end up, but I just know that I have to be a part of the model to make it change in some way, or to at least open the pathway for others to take up the cause later. Mm-hmm. So do the folks who are in those marches now have that long game in them? I don't know. We have to wait and see.
And I do take your point that it does seem that there is a multi-generational, multiracial coalition in the various protests we're seeing reported. I don't know how different that is than other moments in the 20th century, but it does seem of note right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is huge. I mean, these protests are large, and they're not just in cities. Right. They're in very small rural areas. I noted that one of the young Black protesters commented on going to a number of the marches and ended up in one that was, very far from her normal community, and said she was about the only Black person in the march, which just stunned her. And what she was also stunned by was the passion of the people in the march, just saying what she was saying, and that felt good in the moment. So I hope it's not just an in the moment thing, that this is the beginning of some concrete, some structural change. And it's also the beginning of having people sort of rethink a lot of things that maybe they didn't know about history, maybe they didn't know about white supremacy and how it manifests, when we say white privilege, what that really means. And now, of course, there's a lot of conversation about, quote unquote, what does defunding the police mean as an answer? So all of this is on the table for discussion. And the more you can have public discussion, the better, because this is how you want to come to some decisions around public policy, is having everybody's focus and attention in the mix.
And I think from my own point of view, seeing many white friends and colleagues begin to realize that racism isn't a Black or person of color issue, it's all our issues, and it's a particularly white issue in some ways, just adds a different perspective that I have not seen personally before.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see, particularly the young people, because for a while now, I travel to a number of college campuses speaking, and a lot of the kids on campus would say to me over and over, you know what, that was y'all's thing. We're above that. And yet I would point out all of these racist incidents on college campuses, and they would just sort of look at me and I say, this is you guys. I'm not on the campus. So there's some clear disconnect about what you understand to be true and what gets played out. So it's not all over. And they would, some of them reluctantly agree. But what I think is interesting is to have people say, wow, I really did not understand the past history and what I call recent history of what this means. That just because you just heard of Ahmaud Arbery and you just heard of George Floyd and you just saw Amy Cooper, this has been going on forever and a day in many forms. I mean, just to think about Rodney King, they barely had video at that point. That was videotape that somebody, got a picture of his being beaten at the hands of the cops. Those 4 cops got off. I mean, these are issues to discuss. So, it's to see it all bubbling to the surface and to see many iterations of the conversation going on in all kinds of groups is really something. If nothing else, people have gotten, I hope, to a higher level of understanding about how these structures are. It's not an individual, I didn't like you, you didn't like me because of my race. It's embedded into our systems in ways that sometimes people can't see.
Well, maybe to start unpacking this racism as a systemic problem, let's turn to a little history and look at this through our topic this evening, which in part is about Black journalists, Black journalism, and media presentation and representation. Could you help set up some distinctions for us between these different categories? Because as we were chatting in advance of tonight's conversation, I was starting to learn that these aren't quite the same thing. They don't mean quite the same thing.
No, so there's been a long history of Black media. That was media that was Black owned and operated very early on, 1800s, around here in Boston. That was my focus of looking around in Boston to see what was going on. And this is not history that I knew well, just so everybody understands. So it was interesting to me to find out about, for example, the Boston Advocate, the Boston Leader, the Boston Courant. These were newspapers that were Black owned and operated in the 1800s. And they were set up for the very reasons that Black media continues, and that is to tell the full story of African Americans in this country. What those people knew in setting up those newspapers is that the stories of how they lived, and for that matter, the stories that other people in the group of African Americans needed to know about, like what's going on right now that impacts my life, there was no access for them without the efforts of these early newspaper folks to do that. And so they got about the business of gathering up the stories in the communities, connecting folks with those stories. But the base of the reason that they existed was really to advocate for a society that was not going to be racist, that there was going to be a desegregated society, particularly for these very early newspapers around in Boston and New England. That's what they wanted to have happen. What I learned was that the reason that there was no race-specific title in the titles of these papers, the Leader, the Courant, the Boston Advocate, is because they were hoping for an integration and that they didn't want to be race specific in their titles. They thought they would put off particularly white people, and so they kept the titles as they were. Now, those papers I didn't know anything about early on, and I learned about, for example, Lillian Lewis, the first African-American woman journalist in Boston, and she started with the Boston Advocate in 1889, disguised her gender, because that was an issue too, as we know, using an anagram of her last name. So she wrote under the pen name Bert Islew, which I thought was quite clever of her to do. And she eventually ended up writing for the Boston Herald, the paper that we know now, because it was founded in 1846. Again, she used the pen name as she did. So that's kind of an amazing thing to think about, all those people who were writing back then. But they were covering the attempts by people to make changes in society that would be helpful and be supportive of Black communities. They were trying to tell the stories of people in Black communities who were still dealing with the kind of issues we're talking about, these police issues that was happening then. They were also trying to tell the stories of triumphs and successes that never got reported. So these were real community papers in the sense of how we think about community papers now. That was the point. The fullness of the American Black experience. Yes, David.
It was interesting to me that the roots of this particular aspect of Black media are happening in Boston at the same time as the Boston Public Library idea was coming together and getting started, because our charter gets signed in 1848. You have these papers starting up in that period or a little bit later. Perhaps there was something in the spirit of the city that was allowing this, particularly your last comment that they chose names because they wanted to see ultimately a more integrated approach to news or reporting.
And life. They were hoping for that would happen in life for, African Americans. Mm-hmm.
And, there's a connection to William Lloyd Garrison at the time, who brings the famous Liberator paper to bear. Himself a white, the white abolitionist movement is happening at the same time as well. I'm just wondering if you could connect some of those dots for us in terms of what's happening in mid-19th century Boston.
Yeah, so after those papers that I just noted, then the next, I think, pivotal point, and this is a name I did know, was William Monroe Trotter, and he founded the Boston Guardian. Again, is not a title that seems to indicate anything race specific, but he was very close to William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionist. He was an abolitionist himself. He was very, very strong, what people would call militant now in the day, about his urging some changes for how Black folks were having to live at that time. His newspaper declared, "None are free unless all are free." And his whole model of sort of kind of militancy and really standing firm for where he was is why I knew about him. So that was a name that I knew about, connected to New England long, long ago. I didn't know the other names. And William Lloyd Garrison actually supported him. So he initially, when they interacted together, they lived in the same building. He wanted to model his paper, the Boston Guardian, on what William Lloyd Garrison was doing with the Liberator, and that all worked together. There's a new book about William Monroe Trotter called Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter by Carrie Greenwich. I should also point out that bringing it forward more in modern day times, I was aware of William Monroe Trotter's history because there's a collective of African-American opinion writers who formed their collective under his name for the very fact that he was a fierce advocate on behalf of African-Americans and on telling the whole story about their lives. So his contribution for me stands out a lot. I should note that a lot of these people that we're mentioning now lived on Beacon Hill. That's where the Black community was, quote unquote, if we want to think about it during that time. So there was a lot of mixing together, talking together, supporting each other. And that was important too in trying to get these various messages out. So there's some plaques now, and if you go on the Black Heritage Trail, you can see where David Walker was, for example. It's another person who was writing during that time. Where Maria Stewart was, she was writing during that time. These are all people who have taken the pen as a sword. I think of Stanley Nelson's documentary, Soldiers Without Swords. And this is about those folks realizing that they had a great amount of power to write about our experiences and put them in the context of what was happening now and advocate for their communities. Now, since that time, there's been a lot of struggle around quote unquote advocacy journalism. You know, the folks that started these papers were real clear about what their role was, and it was to advocate for their communities, and it was to advocate for the freedom of African Americans during that time. They were very clear about it. A little bit later on, you get into discussions about whether or not, well, is that really journalism as we know it today? Is that objective journalism, and what does that mean? And I think some of that is filtered down to have an impact of where we are now, not in a good way, but we can talk about that. But it's impressive to see the work that folks did under, needless to say, quite trying circumstances to make sure that this information got out and got out consistently.
I'm interested in just returning to Lillian Lewis for a second, that she felt she had to change her gender name to be accepted. And we have, you know, themes of women's suffrage running through this period as well. So, you know, is this an example of someone who was dealing with, you know, more with gender or more with race, or are they just, is that an early example of intersectionality, that we've got both things going on together?
Well, Black women journalists have been saying that for 100 years. Black women, period. You know, you cannot separate the two. She was, by the way, an inductee into the New England Women's Press Association, which was unheard of to have someone Black in that organization. So that was a big breakthrough for her. But she understood that. By the way, she became an excellent speaker, traveled around. People really wanted to hear her speak until she made the men mad of the Masonic Temple, and then her popularity kind of cratered a bit. But that'll just give you an example of the delicate balance that she had to walk, and that many of us still have to walk as both Black women, being Black and women in the space of journalism and in life, by the way.
And what took you to go research this particular period to inform where we are today? I'm just intrigued. Was this always something you were interested in, or is this something that you pursued more recently?
Well, I pursued it more recently because we were going to have this conversation, and I thought, well, I should just go back and just see, you know, who are the folks, because I started with William Monroe Trotter, and I realized that I was shortchanging a bunch of other people who came before. They had no idea. And in fact, most recently, in just recent days, I found out that there was a Robert Tiamoa who worked at the Boston Globe. Yep, that Boston Globe as a reporter. His obit said he'd worked there for 22 years, which would mean he would have started in 1890. I know about him because of a book that Larry Finnison wrote about Boston cycling history, and he noted that a Robert Tiamoa took photographs of the then Black bicycling phenomenon, Kitty Knox, during that time. That's a story, of course, he would have covered, because that's right in the African-American community history, and he was there. So who knew? I mean, I'm discovering all these people, and when we get later into the 70s, there's a whole other list of names I did not know.
Well, that's kind of fascinating, but your own personal story in journalism begins long before Boston. Are there a couple of early career stops you want to tell us about?
Well, I started in Memphis. I talked my way into my job, literally. I don't think you could do this now, but I was determined that I wanted to be a reporter, and it made sense to me to think about, let's be a reporter in my hometown. I also graduated from Wellesley, where I now sit on the board of trustees, and went home, had no job. And my father said to me, you have 3 months to have no job. Otherwise, you can get a paper route. Probably people don't know what that is now, but that means going to distribute the papers around in the neighborhood. And you had to know my father to understand he was quite serious. So he said, if you would like to be a Wellesley College graduate with a paper route, that's on you. But that's what's happening in 3 months.
At least you did something in the media business, I guess.
Exactly, that was close to it. So I did. Now, remember, I'd been a applying everywhere, but there were not the kinds of internships and opportunities available to me at that point to sort of break in. I mean, I knew that this was an area I wanted to go to. I'd done a little bit, tiny bit of radio in college. Was the high school columnist, broke the color barrier at my high school, first Black columnist for my high school newspaper, that kind of thing. So I knew this was an area, but I felt better suited to broadcast. Anyway, so I did what any red blood American graduate of college would do when threatened by a parent with a deadline. I waited until very close to 3 months to really get serious. I didn't have a job. And then said, oh my goodness, I better hurry up. So I went to the library. You'll be appreciative of that. I went to the library. There was no Google, and checked on the backgrounds of all the people working at one station in Memphis, got it all together, decided I would make up a plan to go in to see the general manager of the station, WREC at the time, and then it changed to WREG, because I figured that he was the boss of the news director who was ignoring my pleas for employment. So I went on a Friday, close to the end of day, went in, asked his secretary, could I meet with him? She said, do you have an appointment? Which of course she knew I did not. I said, no, I do not. She said, no, you may not meet with him. So I said, oh, okay. So I said, do you mind if I sit here? This would never work today. She said, you can sit there all you want to, but you don't have an appointment. So I sat there trying to formulate my plan B when he came out of his office to talk to her, because she was leaving for the weekend, of course. And I jumped up, I knew who he was, ran over to talk to him, said, Mr. Brakefield, his name was Charles Brakefield, I would like to talk to you. Who knows? Maybe the guy was bored. Who knows? He said, okay. So I went in, had my whole spiel. The only thing I can remember of the meeting is he held up his hand at one point and said, slow down, you're inside. you can slow down. I did. I made my case for hiring local people. I noted how many people on the staff were local and not. And he called the news director over and said, don't we have an opening? The news director said, yes. He said, well, put Miss Crossley in as an audition. I prepped myself for the audition. I'm sure I was perfectly horrible, but I was poised. And I got a job, and it was a part-time job, which is probably why the bar was a little bit lower. And then I was part-time for 3 months, and then after that I was full-time, and that's how my career got started. Went from there to Indianapolis, and from Indianapolis to Boston. This is local television. And then in Boston, did a pivot to public media, which I never considered before, and ended up in a quite innovative news programming called the 10 o'clock news here at WGBH, which was really pivotal in helping me shape how to do contextual news reports. So,
and as I understand, I mean, congratulations on talking your way into that first job. Where would we be without that? But I understand that the 10 o'clock news was a new concept and a little bit freer, if you will, in terms of its opportunities for individuals. So what was that like? I mean, it started in 1976, ran till 1991.
It was amazing on several levels. First of all, it was the only daily newscast in PBS at the time. Well, there wasn't anybody. I don't know who decided to take a gamble on it, but it was a good one. There were a number of freelancers who came in and out, and some staffers, which allowed for a real interesting mix of really good reporters who went on to do to work other places in Boston and around the country, are still in journalism today or went on to do other things. But the point of how the coverage was going to be was very different from what was happening at commercial stations, where your average news story was about a minute and a half, because that's what I knew about in my days at WREC. And these stories were at least 3 minutes, and it was required of you to put in that context, that historical context. It was required of you not to come back with 2 sides if there were 3 or 4 sides. You needed to go in depth about how you would cover these pieces. And it really opened me up to thinking about deeper ways of coverage. And it was very local. I mean, really focused on local, which I appreciate then. I appreciated then and appreciate now, and certainly how I focus on my radio show, Under the Radar with Callie Crossley. So the combination of that, plus working with these talented other folks, and some of our news directors who, played very close attention to what we did. We had a daily critique of our work, and not to me mean just, hey, maybe you could have done it this way, or how about this? So it was a great exchange and a very constructive way to work that I took with me. And that was the beginning of understanding how to do longer pieces and to think about them more thoughtfully. So later on, when I ended up at the network at ABC News 2020, I was in mind to do that. I knew how to begin to think about a story in more than, one act, as we would say. There are 3 acts. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, but there's a lot going on in between.
And were you one of the first Black women to hold such a position in Boston journalism? I mean, I think we both will cite a few other names, but tell us about what that was like.
Well, you know what? It's interesting because when you start looking back, there are just most stops I made, I was the only one. So in my newsroom, I was accustomed to that. I once had a very long conversation with a colleague at my Indianapolis station who was certain that I had gotten my job because of affirmative action. And he was quite angry that he thought that he had not been able to get a job at the station because, all this time, they were saying they had to hire someone Black. But I asked him to look around the newsroom, and I said, there's one of me in the 15-person staff, and there's 14 other slots. So you had 14 chances, I had 1. And there was a pattern back then that if one Black reporter left, you probably had a job opportunity, but if nobody left, you didn't, because they weren't going to hire 2. So that was the arc of my career from most of the beginning. And it changed a little bit, as time went on. But being one of was interesting in my own space at, let's say, at WGBH, but the city, across the city, there were other people being the first. And so there was this nice, circle of support and as you got to meet people. But that really didn't change on a wholesale level until the founding of the National Association of Black Journalists. And then that brought together so many journalists, not just from here that I had met before, because I wasn't even working here when the organization was founded, or even when I went to my first convention. But I got to meet and connect, as I still can through that organization, people who are here working at other places that I might not otherwise interact with.
Yeah, I remember, because neither of us grew up in Boston, although you went to college here. I moved here in 1992. And one of the things one does to work out the culture that you've moved into is pay attention to who's reporting news and who are the trusted individuals, both nationally and locally. And just thinking back in preparation for today's conversation, it's names like Gwen Ifill, Liz Walker that come to mind. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your colleagues?
Well, Liz Walker, people may find this just so amazing. She was the first co-anchor, Black co-anchor in Boston, and that was, I'm trying to just find the year because it was later than you think. And then after that, there was Dolores Handy over at Channel 7 and some other folks. But that was a huge thing when she got to be co-anchor. I mean, that was, and I can only imagine how she's, how much pressure is on her. People may know.
1981, I think.
Yes, that's right. People may know now that she's Reverend Liz Walker, since she transitioned out of local television and went into the ministry. But when she was holding up, she had to represent a lot. That was a lot of pressure. And of course, she had to be excellent, as she was. On the national scene, when you talk about Gwen Ifill, Gwen started in Boston. She graduated from Simmons. She started work at the Herald and as an intern. She also worked at the Bay State Banner. The Bay State Banner was established in 1965, and that was very important opportunity for many Black journalists who are all scattered across the country now, who can look back on the opportunities working at that newspaper provided them. And certainly one of those people, and Gwen often spoke about what she learned at the Bay State Banner. And then she worked at the Boston Herald after she graduated from Simmons. While she was an intern at the Boston Herald, just so people understand that none of this transition was easy for any of the first. Being the first is often so hard. There was another reporter at the Herald before Gwen, certainly Black reporter, but you know, there she is alone in the time in terms of numbers. And while she was an intern, somebody left a note on her desk saying, you know, N-word, get out of here. And it could have devastated her, but she's a pretty strong woman if you knew Gwen Ifill. And she spoke to her bosses about it. They were horrified. And she said that she wasn't going to let that stop her. I mean, all of us, certainly in those early days, have, you know, stories like that. And some have stories like that now. But you know, that was just the terrain, what you had to work through. And you had to determine if this is something you wanted to do in your life, if this was a career for you, as I determined, then you wanted to be in the space. So the Black journalists that made their way into quote unquote white media, most of us got there after Reverend King's death, because the Kerner Commission was something that was put together by Lyndon Johnson after the 1967 riots. The result of that was the commission said, you need to address white supremacy, and you need to make sure these media outlets need to hire folks of color. That sort of sat around, nothing happened. Then Dr. King died. The explosion happened in cities across the country, except in Boston, as we all know. And then, you know, the news outlets, the quote unquote white news outlets, got a little bit more serious about hiring folks. And that made a huge difference. So there's all of those pioneers. Many of them are just at the point of retirement now. But even that generation behind them, I would still consider, you know, pathway breaking folks. And we're still, sadly, I say sadly because you would think that there were some firsts that we still wouldn't be accomplishing at this late date in 2020, but yet we are. And that's important, to acknowledge the people that went before that did a lot of this. And Gwen was certainly one of those. I miss her so much. She was fabulous journalist, by the way. She's represented on a stamp. She's 43rd in the Black Heritage Stamps series. I would love for her to have been here to see that. And that's pretty amazing.
And we have a journalism center named after her now at Simmons.
At Simmons, yes. Yes, but she was very proud to be a graduate of Simmons.
There is one other name in this group that I would like to just hear your thoughts on, and that's Sarah Ann Shaw, who was force, is a force for nature, but was in the newsroom in a certain way. Also a pioneer.
She was at WBZ. She was the first African-American woman hired at WBZ. But when she got there, Walt Sanders was there, and so was Charlie Austin. And then she came in, and Sarah Ann was already advocating for more folks of color to be hired across the board, for the stories of Black communities to be told in every venue. She'd actually worked on Basic Black, what we did, the program we know as Basic Black, which was Say Brother. Right. So many people came through Say Brother, through the production side and the editorial side, and went on to do other things, and she was one of them. And then she went over to WBZ, where she was determined to make certain that the stories that those first Black newspapers were trying to tell about the holistic life experience of African Americans were being told in the context of the telling of all local stories in Boston. And she worked very hard, and her influence really went beyond WBZ. It was across the board in Boston, and I would dare say across the board in the United States. She's one of those pioneers whose reach was long and deep. And she was a mentor to so many people. Also, just having an example like her was helpful. Just a fun fact, a lot of people don't know that Soledad O'Brien, who many know now is doing a show on Channel 5 called Matter of Fact, and has done many documentaries on CNN and all around, was at WBZ as a production intern, learning at her feet. And will tell you that was important to be there with her. So there are many who benefited from each of those pioneers. Their tentacles are long now in the way that they sort of tapped us with the baton to keep going forward.
Yeah. And you had a contribution to make to the Eyes on the Prize series. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came to pass, and what was that like, and maybe a couple of other individuals that you worked with? I mean, from my limited knowledge, that became one of the quintessential educational programs for helping teach people about race and the civil rights movement?
Still is, David. Just want to make that clear. It's in the series Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years. Is in every library in the world, practically. It's cited by all manner of scholars. It's still considered one of the best documentaries ever. I'm very proud of that work. We all worked extremely hard to get that story right. We worked under Henry Hampton, again, a connection back to Say Brother. He was a commentator on Say Brother at the time. He went on to set up his own production company, Black Side Incorporated, which is where we produced Eyes on the Prize. When the series was done, then it aired on WGBH, but it was a production of Black Side Incorporated. And so many of the people who worked on that program have gone on to do other documentaries, have gone on to influence other people in doing documentaries, news, or whatever. And for me, it was and remains one of the seminal events in my career. I can't even explain the breadth and the depth of what it meant to meet the people who pretty much laid their bodies down so that I could be where I am today, to cover this history, which is American history, and it hadn't been covered well, to see it responded to by so many. I still talk about it everywhere. And so many of the people who worked on the series with me still in conversation about it, because there's so many ways to look at it, not only just what happened, why it happened, here again with the context. We're talking about how we shored up democracy at a time, what Black people's role was in that, the importance of the civil rights movement as a forerunner to the anti-war movement and the women's movement and every other movement that came behind, the use of the tactics first initiated by the folks in the civil rights movement, the strategizing around protest marching. I mean, so much is in that series that needs to be looked at, and even down to the looking at police response to unarmed protesters. The scene on the bridge in Selma, it sadly could look like today in some cities. So if you don't know that history, then you can't feel or see that, the echoing of that. So for me to have the privilege, and I do consider it a privilege, to work with him, to work with the people who told their stories, some of them for the first time, and a lot of them have died, was just a great honor and privilege of my life. And I am very proud of the product, which has not been challenged ever for its accuracy, and been praised many times for the execution of how we told the story. So, I mean, I could go on and on about it. Many, many stories about it. I talked my way into that job too. but which seems to be the story of my life. But it's very, very important, not just for me, but certainly for students of history, and certainly for people who are interested in strategy and protest movement.
I'd like to move forward a little bit to the Obama years, where many of us at the time thought this was a groundbreaking development to have our first Black president. Perhaps there's more nuance to some of his policies now looking back. But what did that mean for journalists, and Black journalists in particular? Not that I'm going to ask you to speak for all Black journalists, but I do think you have a perspective that could help illustrate what that moment may have been about.
Well, we've been talking about certain pivotal points when the doors got opened a little bit wider for Black journalists, certainly for Black journalists in quote unquote white media. And that was one of those times, because again, by the way, parity has never been achieved in these newsrooms. So we're talking teeny tiny percentages still, even in 2020. And that's a problem, because as I said, a number of the pioneers are now retiring. What are we going to do? And with this COVID-19 situation, who knows who will be left standing, because a lot of people have had to cut back. But my point is that when President Obama came in, some newsrooms looked around and appropriately said, oh, maybe we ought to have a few more folks in here with some perspectives that would be appropriate during this period of time. And so there was an expansion in some circles of analysts and commentators. The people had been there doing the work, but they didn't have the opportunities for some of the platforms that they were able to be a part of during that time. So, I have many friends who were a part of that White House group that travels around, and, they were the first time on Air Force One. They were in small group situations with the President of the United States, which they never had been before, and able to talk about some issues still of concern to African American communities, but also just to be a part of a scene that had not always had limited numbers of folks, and that the limited numbers were still limited, but there were a few more, and I think it made an impression for folks when they looked up on the news screens or heard on the radios or read the bylines, to have those perspectives. There is one truth, but there are many perspectives. And to have the perspectives of those folks who are able to access some of these platforms, some for the first time, was an extremely important situation. Now, after the Obama years, some of those people didn't have those platforms anymore. Just want to point that out. So the struggle continues.
Right. It's almost like there was a reversion in some ways post that period. Callie, you've used a phrase that I don't want to just let go. I'd like you to just clarify for our viewers and attendees. And it's this Black journalists being successful in white media, as distinct from Black media or ethnic media, as it's sometimes, which is a phrase that I'm not sure we need to dwell on, but could you just make sure that we understand what point you're making?
We talked about like the Bay State Banner. In my hometown, there was a Tri-State Defender. My parents were huge consumers of news, which is where I first became interested in it. They read all of what some might call mainstream newspapers, but they knew then, and I understood then, that our stories were often not in there unless it was about crime. And that's just the truth. So the stories of what happened in our normal lives was never talked about, or we were never included in coverage that we should have been, like, back to school stories, or people bicycling, or, I think about Chris Cooper being a birder, and I know a lot of people were like, Black birder, what? There are Black folks doing everything, and yet they were never included in those stories. It was like we were in, part of a foreign nation. So Black media has served and continues to serve a very important role in making sure that the fullness of our experience has been told. So when Black journalists who did not work for Black media, but now worked for what some would call corporate media, which of course is, for the most part that I know of, owned by white people. That's a different lens. They brought their lived experience with them. They brought their perspectives, and they were able to say, hey, we're doing a back to school story. What about the kids going to school over here? And honestly, you think that sounds so simple. That's like a brand new idea in so many newsrooms. Believe me, I've had these conversations. And so that's what I mean by that. When I say white-owned media, that's what I mean by that, about those Black journalists who took their skills and talents and went to work in those newsrooms, often at great stress and tension. It was hard, and it continues to be hard for a number of reasons. Because if you have a majority of opinion about what's important to cover and what's not so important to cover, and here comes somebody with a different perspective, that's a discussion. I mean, you would like for it to be eye-opening. In the best of all possible worlds, you have so many perspectives in a newsroom, because that's what we're supposed to be covering, is everybody. We're the arm of the people, not of some people. That should make it rich. And when I've been able to be a part of discussions that include a wide variety of perspectives, boy, is it rich. And you see it turn up in the coverage. That's what you want.
Because otherwise you're left then dealing with stereotypes or assumptions or unconscious biases, and that's simply not reality, and it's not as rich a conversation, as you say.
Or even surprise, David, like, oh my God, somebody would put his knee on this man on tape. You know what I'm saying? I've had conversations here, and this is real dangerous territory in Boston. First of all, I'm not a sports fan, period. So let's start there. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But one of the reasons that if I were going to go be a part of any of the sports that are widely available here and people love in Boston, I'm not going to an arena where I might hear something I don't want to hear, or where I am tense the whole time thinking I'm going to hear something. It's just, that's not a fun experience. Like I might go to Fenway Park and have, you know, a hot dog or something and just, you know, absorb the kind of atmosphere. That might be fun for me, but it's not fun for me because I know that's the scene of where people really lose their minds. There was many, many years ago when I worked in Indianapolis, I was sent to cover the Indianapolis 500. Well, my bosses, you know, I'm just a regular reporter. I could assign anybody, and certainly I could do any story. In the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh God, I hope this is okay. Well, it wasn't. I got there and it was, you know, racial epithet after racial epithet, to the point that for the first and only time in my career, I said, okay, I'm not doing this. So my crew and I packed up and I went back to the newsroom and I said, you know, I'm not a person, as you know, to come back without the story, but I'm not doing that. You send somebody else. And I told them and they were like, oh my God, oh my God. But, you know, that's a reality for a lot of us. So these are some of the things that you think about.
And is Boston getting better? Is it the same? Is it making 2 steps forward, 1 step back? What's your take on Boston in terms of race?
Well, first of all, you know Boston's reputation as the most racist city in the country. You've heard that before. I mean, Michael Che got in big trouble not long ago. Well, not for him, but you know when he said it again, because that's just the prevailing attitude of most Black people looking in from outside. And so what I would say is that there's a lot of lack of acknowledgement still about many of the things going on here in Boston. It's probably not the racist city in the country. There's many others where racism exists and is manifested in many ways that go on right here in Boston. So there is that. But there is no question about it. There's some stuff going on here that, you know, it's a long game and you have to talk about it. You need to be interested in working through it. And so many of those issues continue to come up, including the most recent when we talk about police interaction with communities. That's an issue here. It's long been an issue here. In fact, the Bay State Banner did a series not long ago about how some of the young people who were being considered in gangs by the police or had been identified as gangs who were not in gangs. And there was a whole question about how do you determine who's in a gang, who's not in a gang. And some of this was cultural material, some of it was not. So there's a lot to unpack at any given day. We're all working through, we're all works in progress. This is true. But I think when you begin with the acknowledgement that it exists, so often when I say these things, and, you know, I know I'm already getting, you know, hate mail from people saying, what do you mean you don't go to Fenway Park? What do you mean? That doesn't happen. And in fact, when the Baltimore Oriole, who got the peanuts thrown at him and the epithets thrown at him, made the statement, I had to argue with people who said to me, that doesn't happen. That did not happen. Okay. Well, you know, we can't have a conversation if you're not going to begin with acknowledging that it did happen. Okay, now that it's happened, what are we going to do about it? Or how are we going to respond to it? But to say that it doesn't happen is just ridiculous. And that's the frustration that I think a lot of people feel in Boston. So when you say, are things better? Well, of course, legally they're better. Of course, in some social circles, certainly they're better. But there's a lot of other stuff that still comes up in ways you would not imagine, that you would think that people who are pretty knowledgeable in general about life would know, and they don't.
You I think, mentioned a recent Pew study about the actual numbers of Black employees working in media and journalism. I just think it'd be helpful to share some of those so we have some quantities, some metrics around where we are today.
So the report was last year, it looked at data from up through 2017, 2012 through 2017. I'm trying to find my exact notes, but this was imprinted on my brain. But the bottom line was it's 2% that folks of color, and specifically African Americans, made up 2% in these newsrooms. And remember, that was captured then. I don't know where we're going to be now after COVID and everything else that's going on now.
And you're specifically concerned that some media outlets just won't survive economically because of where we are post-COVID.
They've already made moves. There are any number of journalists across the board who've already lost jobs now. So the question is, if we're just cutting because it's an economic thing and there's no attention paid to what are you left with if you are still going to go forward, are there some diverse perspectives left to still, cover the news? That's a problem. And I worry about it. And here's the other thing that is problematic. The American Society of Newspaper Editors was just merged with a different group. Every year used to do an audit of print newsrooms just to look at what the percentage was, whether it was going up or down of folks of color in the newsroom. And last year they decided, we're just not going to do it because people are not responding, meaning those organizations. And organizations are not responding because the numbers aren't good. But we need to know, what it is.
If there are some reporters that we all should be aware of to make sure that we're paying attention to their reporting about either Black journalists or journalists working on Black issues, who are some of the names today that you would want to cite to say, okay, these are the people to pay attention to, in addition to Beat the Press and Basic Black and so forth, of course?
Well, certainly Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's at the New York Times. She was the creator of the main driver, working with her editors at the New York Times, of the 1619 Project, which has been a phenomenal project. It also has attending podcasts. The series of reports itself are fabulous. The writing is exquisite. She tapped into every expert you can think of. And it's a real gift because she looks at how democratic roots are in the time of slavery, but she brings it forward so that you can see what the connections are today. And I think so often people say, well, when you talk to me about slavery or when you talk to me about what happened in Reconstruction, that's old time. What does that have to do with today? Well, actually has a lot to do with today. So she makes those connections and she continues to make those connections. So I would urge people to A, pay attention to the 1619 Project, and B, she's been speaking quite a lot recently with regard to what's happening in the wake of the George Floyd killings. And she has a lot to say that I think is important. NBC's Tremaine Lee has been covering this a lot as well. Byron Pitts, who used to work here in Boston at Channel 5, is at Nightline. He's been doing some important work. In fact, he did I think a fabulous piece looking at Black journalists and what is the trauma of working on these stories. What is it like to be out there in the field or even in the studio covering it, day after day, and watching and listening and knowing that the people, George Floyd looks just like you. That was an important piece of work. Certainly Michelle Miller over at CBS, very, very important work. Right here in Boston, some of the commentary from Janae Osterholt and Renee Graham on the Boston Globe, very, very important work. They always ground their pieces in history, in context, so that you never start just today. You have a sense of where it came from, which is critically important when we talk about issues of race and justice in this country. And these are people I think of some more as I had more time. I'm happy to add to the list of other people think about it, but those are just a few to begin with.
We've both mentioned lists of names throughout the conversation so far, so I'm sure we'll hear from other friends who we didn't mention that maybe we should have tomorrow.
Oh yeah,
but,
yeah.
That's always the way. What is your, and we'll start to take some questions from our audience at this point. So there's a few lined up I want to take, and then if there are others coming in through Q&A, if we have time, we'll go through those as well. One of these questions from Stephen talks about how the media is covering the George Floyd story, and are they covering it well? Are they covering it enough? I think we've also, I want to tie this to the question of what the coverage of the different protests has been like as well.
Well, I have an issue with the coverage, a lot of it, starting off with the protests were mainly peaceful. Then they go on to say what's happening. I mean, I think what we've seen, and actually what's been documented now, are that a lot of these, the people who were causing the violence are not the protesters. They are definitely looting. They are definitely destroying property, but and I'm not talking about making them outside agitators. I prefer to call them infiltrators. So there are always, anytime you have a protest movement, people who choose to infiltrate because it's an opportunistic moment for them to do something else that's disruptive and is not focused on what the other people holding up the signs, move to join the people who are holding up the signs are doing. And we know that. But somehow when there's ever a protest about particularly racial justice, you know, the whole thing gets, can get, you know, broadsided or tarred with, oh, well, it's just all of them. You know, these, you know, and aren't we glad that these people who were just so violent could be peaceful today? Let's start with talking about what the protests were all about, the demonstrators who were there to make a point, who are very articulate in saying why they're there and what they hope to have changed and how they were moved to come out. Because, by the way, this is a dangerous time to be out in a crowd, as we know, because of COVID-19. So I like a little bit more emphasis on that. Now, having said that, there's been some fantastic coverage, I think, by a lot of journalists doing the kind of contextual reporting I like to see on a regular basis. You know, across the board, there are not many places you can look now without seeing folks trying to go deeper. Right. There's also been outside of journalism, but sort of journalism allied, I guess, these special programs. You know, Oprah's doing 2 parts. Yeah, Gayle King is doing something late. I think every network has done something. The newspapers and the digital spaces have taken to pointing out resources for folks, taking a deeper dive into one part or some parts of the issue, being if it's who are the protesters, why are they there, what do they mean by justice, how is this happening, what is the history of this, what do we mean by structural change. All of this is getting covered in some really well done ways. If you don't want to know about it now, you just didn't want to know. You're having to ignore. So the question will become after this, after thousands and, you know, tens of thousands have shown up in the street, you know, how will the coverage continue? And it will need to be, because that movement will have continued, I presume. I think it will. And so we can't get bored and say, well, didn't we do that protest last week? Let's not do another one. Or didn't we talk about structural racism 2 days ago? I don't think how we. You know, this is an ongoing problem. There are many ways to cover ongoing issues. And I think we want to be creative about that and see that happening. So I would have to say, for the most part, I've been impressed by, you know, what people have been able to express and report.
There's a follow-up question from Sarah that says, do you have any advice to college newsrooms in covering these protests and the issue of racial justice and systemic racism?
Well, what I would say is, you know, whenever you have a niche publication, and the college newspapers are a niche publication, you know, focus on your audience. Your audience are college students, and there are so many of them out in the protest movement. You know, who are they? You know, why are they moved to do it? Lots of them first time. There are storylines out there that I found on TikTok, actually, of young people having real strong disagreements with parents who are going in an opposite direction than they are. So they're in the street. They believe this is important for them, a moment for them to express that justice has not been served, and their parents are saying, I don't agree with you. And it's been very emotional. You know, tell the story of your fellow college students, and do it in a way that, you know, allows everybody in. Everybody doesn't have to agree. So there are many people who don't agree. Well, why not? What about George Floyd's death that did not move you, if it comes to that? What didn't you understand before? There's so many arenas to go. And the fact that, is this the tipping point for young people? I mean, is this it? Because they're in the lead. By the way, the Gen Zs and the millennials are a bigger cohort than the baby boomers. So we can look at the Al Sharptons giving the eulogy, for example, but the people who are, you know, in the lead of this and who are in large numbers are young people.
And this was already true for the anti-gun violence movement,
Exactly.
the climate change movement.
Exactly.
One of the questioners referenced this 11-year-old reporter, Jaden Jefferson, that we're seeing on the current topic as well. So there is more evidence than this particular moment to suggest younger people are engaging in this topic in a way that we haven't seen recently. I'd love your thoughts on if we saw that in the 1960s version of the civil rights movement, or leading up to 76, 78.
Well, the students were, you know, my God, they were so important to the civil rights movement, and their commitment was really so extraordinary. I mean, let's just talk about those young people who signed up to be freedom riders and who wrote their wills before they got on those buses, because many of them assumed they would not live through the experience. David, I don't know. Would I be strong enough to do that? I don't think so. And not just one or two. These were a lot of committed students. And so that level of dedication and commitment is out there, and you need to talk about it. I mean, earlier I talked about going to college campuses and having exchanges with students who said baby boomers were the root of all evil in terms of, you know, racial issues here in the country. Well, I've seen differently. So for that young person wanting to know what to cover in the college newspaper, go back and look at those incidents on college campuses. Talk to me about what was happening then, what may not be happening now. What is that environment about? There's lots of stories.
And I think, you know, while the question was about college newsrooms, you know, with the advent of the internet, we have the opportunity for any, you know, citizen journalist to emerge onto the scene. You mentioned TikTok, there are other platforms as well. And so I think these principles apply to anyone who wants to get their message out or have their voice heard. Do you see pros and cons to that movement of having opportunity for anybody to become maybe not a professional journalist, but a citizen journalist at least? And I use the term citizen broadly. I just want to say that.
Oh, I understand that. Well, yeah, the problem is, of course, if there are problems to it, is that everybody's not operating with the tenets that journalists, I'm talking about capital J journalists, should be operating under, which is, you know, accuracy needs to be there. Not something you just heard, unless it's in the context of telling me about what you have documented to be true. As in a story about this is what's going around, but here's what really happened. Okay, that's a story, but your story can't be centered around here's what I heard. That's not journalism. Certainly not the journalism that I was trained to do. So I think it's important that those platforms are out there. I think it's really important that there are many voices and opportunity for those many voices to actually reach some of the other influential voices who are covering this movement and will be for some time. That's very important. I just want to see accuracy and documentation.
Well, and perhaps some media literacy to be able to tell fact reporting from opinion reporting from editorializing, whether you're producing that work or absorbing that work.
Well, the only way you get to that, David, is that you have to not be going to your one place that you go to get your information. You have to go to many places. And that's the work of being media literate, that a lot of people don't think they have to do or don't want to do. And by the way, that includes going to places where your inner self does not agree with. You know, you've got to go to those places where somebody else has a different opinion about, or a different perspective about what is going on, to really inform you in a contextual way of what's happening.
My principle is that discourse can only happen between people who don't agree. Otherwise, it's just a chat. So there's one question here that I wanted to clarify something you said earlier, and this was about Boston's reactions to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, that the reactions here were different than in other parts of the country.
It's a great story. There is a documentary that's been done, and my colleague Bob C. did a very long report looking at this on the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination. And so what happened in Boston was that James Brown, R&B singer James Brown, was scheduled for a concert. And there was great fear that there would be the kind of uprising or people expressing themselves in anger and frustration after Dr. King's assassination, as had happened in 110 other cities, or was happening across the country. And so a contingent of folk, including Boston City Councilor Thomas Atkins, who is Black City Councilor, and others, went to Mayor Kevin White and said, hey, what if we, try to open up this concert, just persuade James Brown to have the concert, but to calm down people here and make it available so that everybody would just be concentrated on the concert and not be thinking about going into the street to do something destructive. And Kevin White, I'm told, didn't know who James Brown was, but that's another story. But anyway, he said, okay, sounds good. And and WGBH is involved as well, because they went to WGBH and said, would you broadcast this live so that people could stay in their homes to watch this? And WGBH said yes. And so this concert went on through the night. People watched it. James Brown performed. He also talked to the crowd in between about the importance of just protecting your own space and community. And yes, you should be angry, and yes, you should be frustrated, but let's not make that a violent response. And it was, one of the cities that did not burn because of that. So it's a great story. It's documented. We got all of that. Please look at the archives at WGBH and see that story.
There's a question from Annie that got posted from John. How can we work towards effecting change with people who don't agree that there is racism in the country? Do we just choose not to engage with them, or is there some other process that we can engage in?
Well, I think I have a couple of reactions. First of all, where are they in believing that there's no racism? Because I would argue that before George Floyd was murdered right before our eyes, there are people who would argue you up and down that kind of thing does not happen. He must have done something to provoke it. He must, somebody else must have done something. The video is going to show something else that happened. It never happens before. Before the video of Amy Cooper, knowing full well what would happen if she called the police and said, an African-American man is threatening me and my dog in Central Park, she counted on that racism that's embedded in a lot of people to work for her. She knew exactly what she was doing. But there are many people who would say, that does not happen. That doesn't happen. You people have exaggerated. You folks like to say racism every other day. So are you talking about those people who, to some degree now, have had their eyes opened? Now you can say it's late. Yeah, it is. But some people have had their eyes open. Or are you talking about what I would just call the unrepentant folks that I don't care what evidence there is to the contrary, they just don't want to hear it because they've come up with some other fantasy about how this all exists. And so you can make a connection with people who are for the first time, I think late, but they are for the first time saying, wow, this really did happen. Wow, how is this, what's going on here? And is there actually something that individuals can do? I think you can make a connection with those folks, even if they are trying in this moment to say, but that's a one-time situation. It wouldn't happen like that again. But for the unrepentant folks, stop wasting breath. You know, at some point you just can't. You just have to put your energy toward making the connection with people who see you, hear you, and want to do better. What is Maya Angelou, what does she used to say? When you know better, you do better. So we have to hope there are more people who know better now who want to do better. That's the direction that I would want to put my energies. And you know, there's plenty of documentation. There's lots of other folks to talk to. Just try to reframe it in that way. And sometimes you can't give up on folks. But I look at those young people on TikTok, and they're very frustrated with their parents. Some of them saying, I don't know what I have to say to you. Well, you know, you go forward with doing the work that you think needs to be done.
It's an individual choice in many ways to own the work that has to be done.
Mm-hmm.
Adrian asks, can you comment on the resignation of Bennett at the New York Times, which was a rather controversial set of circumstances, and you know, what is this process was led by Black journalists and supported by colleagues. What is, Callie, what's your take on how all of that went down?
So first, people have to understand that it's connected to an op-ed that was written by Congressperson, is he a senator? I believe he's a congressperson, Tom Cotton. And the essence of it was bring the federal troops and, you know, set them on the streets to quell the violence, which, as you know, is not just controversial, but you know, some people believe is unconstitutional. And so the idea of sending federal troops to quell violence against American citizens is just, that's a serious step you want to take. And it's so serious that General Mattis, one would presume, knows something about combat, broke his silence and said, wait a minute, now you're mirroring what's happening in authoritarian countries. Now that's the piece of the editorial. So inside the New York Times, people were concerned about both the process by how this ended up being published and some of the content, which as Black journalists and others, because 1,000 journalists at the New York Times signed a petition to their editor saying, this is dangerous to the lives of Black journalists who are out in the field. When this man is calling for troops to turn on protesters, the people who are often caught in the crosshairs of this are Black journalists. And so now you're talking about, you know, people's lives. That's, something has to be said. Why would you want to put that in the newspaper? So I maintain that if the purpose was to have a conservative response to what was going on, that there are many conservative voices who would not be saying, let's turn firepower on American citizens. They would offer, I would like to quell the violence if that's their point. And here's what I would suggest, and here's why I think there's a problem. But you could get a thoughtful response to that, and that could be published. Why this one? And this is what the journalists were saying, like, really? I don't get that. And then, as it turns out, when they delved into the process, the top editor, Bennett, did not read the editorial before it was published. So there was stuff in it that should have been caught by people paying attention. Make your point as you want to make it, but there's things in that editorial that should have been caught by an editor, particularly writing on such a piece that was going to indeed be controversial. The deputy editor did. I don't know if they threw him under the bus or not, can't answer that. But that's what led to his resignation. And that's why Black journalists raised their voices, because this is an was of concern in the moment. Now, you can argue, should he have resigned? Should they have accepted his resignation? Was there a better way to handle this? I can't answer that. But I do know that it violated some of the New York Times's policies and guidelines. And for that reason, which was something that was raised by the journalist, he was asked to resign.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're clarifying that there appears to have been negligence or dereliction of duty in exercising the editorial role is certainly part of that decision that we know about.
I want to make it clear that I am not suggesting that there should not be a conservative response.
Right.
So I just want everybody to know that's not that, and nor was anybody else, by the way, those 1,000 journalists that signed that. Go ahead.
I think I'll make this my final question, if that's okay. We referred in our introduction to you as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. What do you get to do as that in that role and that fellow? I think that means you can get to speak to many of our college students around the country.
Yes, this program was under the aegis of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation for many, many years, and then in recent years switched to the Council of Independent Colleges. And these are small liberal arts schools that have some ability to bring speakers to campus, but didn't have the bottom line power, if you will, to bring in some bigger names and more people to campus. And so this is a program that the purpose is to shore up small liberal arts schools, talk about the importance of them, and to allow them an opportunity to have a wider variety of speakers. So you have to be nominated to be one, and then schools ask for you. So typically I do about 2 or 3 appearances strictly for the Woodrow Wilson program every year. It's very interesting. I really enjoy it because it keeps me very much connected with what's going on. And the small schools are located all over the country. So I get to go to smaller schools and see how they're approaching some serious topics. Often I'm either asked to talk about race, history. I did one talk about just how to have difficult conversations, and on and on. And it's great. You go on the campus for nearly a week, and you speak to a lot of classes, and then you usually have one big event where there's an exchange with students.
And if we want to keep up with your work currently, where do we find you on radio and television and in print?
Well, I'm hosting Under the Radar with Callie Crossley. You can find that show every Sunday at 6 at WGBH 89.7. I host Basic Black, which appears on Friday nights on WGBH TV. I appear on Boston Public Radio, which is our midday show on Fridays. That's with Jim and Marjorie. And I appear on Beat the Press, which airs on Fridays as well. And then on Mondays, I have a commentary that runs weekly every Monday. It airs at 6:45 and 9:45.
That's amazing. So now we know where to find you and keep up with your work. Callie, thank you so much for joining me this evening and joining all of us. We were able to cover a little bit about current topics, delve back into history, and understand the evolution of Black journalists, Black journalism, and media in general, as well as the most important work that we all have to do as a society around race and systemic racism. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Our thanks go to the WGBH Forum Network, the Lowell Institute, and once again to the Museum of African American History for the idea for tonight's conversation. Thank you. See you next week.